Hi y'all, and welcome back to another video of My Creative Life with Kelssweetie, where we read books and we make art. Today we are covering some weird lit faves for Pride Month. Now, these are all queer stories by queer authors, and you may be noticing some of my favorites are missing out of here. If y'all have been around here for a while, I'm gonna do some honorable mentions real quick, a little roundup. Chlorine by Jade Song, The Women Could Fly by Megan Giddings, Model Home and Sorrowland by River Solomon. These are all wonderful, wonderful books and should be on this list in any other capacity. However, I talk about those books so much on this channel, and a matter of fact, I have some favorite recommendation videos coming up later on this month that feature those books more in depth. So I'm trying to give a little bit of shine to some other books that I feel like may not hear as much this month. I wanted to make sure that I was fitting as many queer authors and queer stories as possible into a month like this because I read queer all year. It was a layup for me to try and find any books that to recommend to y'all because in this genre, because that's basically, I'm averaging at least one queer story a month. That's how I like it. Let's get into the intro and get into these recommendations. Mentioned in the intro, I read queer all year. I really want to make a sticker out of it because when it comes to Pride, it sometimes is difficult for my reading roundup of a TBR to really look any different than what maybe it looks like any other time, because I am constantly reading something that at least is a tinge queer. Like, it doesn't have to be full stop. But more than likely, when I did this list, I realized looking at my bookshelves, that's queer. She's bi. Yep, the identity crisis is there. We're talking about this is a metaphor for queerness. It's because horror is inherently in a lot of ways queer. So I really hope that y'all like some of these recommendations. A good portion of them I feel like we don't hear enough of, and there's some of my favorites. They're not my top favorites, as I mentioned in the beginning, but these definitely deserve to be read. First and foremost is one that I read last month. I have not had a chance yet to talk to y'all about how much I love it because my May wrap-up is coming soon. The Dead Take the A Train by Cassandra Call. If you love the movie Constantine, but you were like, needs to be more gay. Our main character, Julie, is basically our Keanu Reeves Constantine figure. She works in dark magic. She works in exorcising demons and monsters and otherworld entities and all of that. And this gets gory. It gets dark. Intestines and ripping open of body and melting. All of that is happening in this book, and it was wonderful. It's Cassandra Call. She's going to give you that. However, one thing that I did really like about this is that Julie is bisexual. She just got out of a relationship with someone who was masked and has a huge crush, has always had a huge crush, and is in love with her best friend, Sarah. Now, Sarah also just got out of a relationship, which was abusive, unfortunately, with somebody who was masked. And there's this whole will they, won't they situation because while it's clear Julie is in love with Sarah, you're not certain on Sarah's intention, except like there's this flirting going on here and there, and like amongst all of the horrifics that's happening in this book, I was kicking my feet in some of these portions that had to do with Julie and Sarah, where I was just like, y'all cute, just be together, all right, just kiss. I love this because it combines so many genres. It was so much fun to read. I highly recommend it. I feel like when I was given the recommendation of this book a while ago, I don't feel like I heard enough about the fact that the main character was bisexual or that there was so much queerness in this novel. We gotta change that, guys. This was fun. This was a lot of fun. All right, I recommend it. Highly recommend it. You'll hear more about it in my May wrap-up video. One that is not so fun at all, but is extremely important because I feel like we do not get enough stories from this identity, and that's Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. I read this last year during November I think I read this during November, not Pride of last month. It broke me. Y'all, if you have read Model Home, if you've read Reservoir Bitches, and if you've read any of those type of heart-wrenching stories, this is in that area. It sits with those books on my shelves. We're hearing about Johnny and their experience being two-spirit on the res as well as out in the city, and what that experience is. They're a sex worker who feeds on the fetish of them being indigenous, and that's a whole conversation and experience all of its own, because then when you go back to their life when they were on the res, they experienced tons of homophobia, tons of abuse because of them being queer. You also constantly hear about the fact that this is another person who was in love with their best friend. They were also pretty much in love with them as well, but unfortunately was not ready to take the step necessary in order to be in a relationship. And this book has to deal with the fact that Johnny is constantly looking to be held, constantly looking for intimacy, while also at the same time trying to protect themselves with this masculinity, this toxic masculinity that's within them. By the end of it, you just want to, there is a yell that happens at the end, and you feel it. You absolutely feel it, because it's frustration and it's hurt and it's just tiredness. This, being as short as it was, fit a lot of turmoil in it. And while I'm not always just gung-ho for the, hey, let's talk about people suffering in their identities and in their experiences type of person, it was worth it, because it really is talking so much about the experience, about being on the reservation, and even past the homophobia that they experience. It also talks quite a bit about the issues in regards to welfare and just overall lack of resources on the reservation. I think that was another thing that was really big eye-opener and learning experience for me reading this novel, and I recommend it quite a bit. I mean, I recommend it, of course, with the caveat, like, prepare to have your heart ripped out and really, like, want somebody, anybody to love Johnny, but even himself. But I do feel like this was a really big learning experience for me, which is unfortunate, because the thing is that we do not get a lot, and we do not get enough two-spirit novels, and I didn't, like, from that identity. I recommend this. It is not as fun as the last one, y'all, but it is absolutely worth it, and I can't recommend it enough. Another novel that is about the fluidity of gender is Womb City by Trotlo Tromase. This book, I recommend this to those who are into the fantasy, steampunk, sci-fi genre. You may ask why. First, let's look at the length. There's a lot of world building in here. Now, if you can stick out the world building, which is immense, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, gorgeous gowns, beautiful, beautiful gowns. The ending, impactful, absolutely impactful. As we move to this story that has to do with our main character and their experience in this future Botswana, where we've learned to gain more time by taking our consciousness and body swapping them into others' bodies. The conversation of what are we outside of our corporeal forms, our physical bodies? What is gender? Does it exist? Does it matter? How do we operate? Who are we as people if this doesn't matter anymore? This is it's just a vehicle. That is discussed in this book, amongst the fact that they're being haunted and hunted down by a steampunk, metaphysical, zombie type of ghost that she may have accidentally killed and ran over with her car, and is slowly taking down her entire family one by one, extremely gory. It's a great novel. There's a lot. Everything but the kitchen sink is in this novel. It is a lot. However, if you can stick through it and you can see all the metaphors and you're just there for the ride, the ending talks about all the things I just mentioned, as well as toxic masculinity, which y'all know I love to read about around here, but also how toxic masculinity is not just masks who perpetuate it. That, you know, women can perpetuate toxic masculinity and feed from it. And that queerness and gender fluidity is something that is meant for all of us. And again, it doesn't necessarily tell you like what to think, but more so asks the question and starts the conversation of what do you think? What are you? You know, every time I feel like I'm constantly this year, ever since I read this book, started thinking more and more about what that means. And again, if you can stick it out, I do recommend this book to you entirely. It is a masterpiece, but it is epic. It is epic in scope. So, another one that I feel like we won't hear enough about. I feel like we were seeing so much about this maybe 2 Februaries ago because of this amazing cover, but we haven't heard much more about it. And I think it's just because it didn't find its, it was being pushed to the horror audience, and I think it should have been maybe pushed to the sci-fi audience because of how long and how epic the scope was, and so it just wasn't landing on the right ears. But the ending of this, I think about almost every day. Okay, this is one you've heard everywhere. Monstralia. Y'all are gonna see this everywhere. Did I just read this for the first time last September? Certainly. It deserves its flowers. It deserves its flowers. I had to put one in here that you're gonna see tons of, because to not have this one in this lineup seemed problematic. It seemed problematic. I feel like when I first started reading this and I was hearing all the recommendations in regards to it, of course I was pulled in by the weirdness of this grieving mother rebuilds a son out of her dead son's lung. Got it. He turns into a monster. They have to figure it out. Is that what this book's about? Sure, on its basis. What is it actually about? Everybody's gay. Everybody's gay. Monstrilio's father is queer. Monstrilio's auntie is queer. Honestly, at the end of the day, I feel like his mama's queer. Everybody is queer. And it's amazing. But what I think it was the most wonderful thing, and the reason why even though this is a very popular book, I felt like I wanted to have it in this lineup, is because I don't see enough of the conversation about why this book is so impactful, and that is because it has to do with a queer masked man, and not necessarily being supported by his mother, which is something that we hear a lot of, but rather is being supported by his father, who is a masked man. And not only is he being supported by him, but his father has learned about his sexuality and how he's queer from seeing the experience of his son and resonating with that experience. That was beautiful. That made me cry. I nearly cried when I started to see how much support his father had for him, and his queerness and the love that he had for him and his identity, and just letting him be who he needed to be, and just being like, okay, just let me know. And in doing so, not just doing so as I'm taking a back seat, just tell me where to go, but rather I'm a spectator, and I've learned from seeing you that I myself have realized I'm bisexual. And by the end of the book, he's with another man and is in love with another man. And that's gorgeous to see, because then you see the flip side of it with Monstrilio's mother, who is so stuck on her child beforehand and has so many issues with the fact that Monstrilio isn't that child and can't really understand where Monstrilio's identity lies and is trying to make him someone else, which is interesting considering she's the reason why he's even here in the first place. I think that was a discussion that isn't done enough in novels, especially where queer men. And I thought it was really beautiful. I just don't see that enough. When people talk about this book, they talk about the weird portion of it. It's a guy, it's some monster made from a lung. The best part of this has nothing to even do with that. I wanted to kind of put this one in here because I wanted to get that discussion off and talk about that, because we deserve so many more stories that have that experience, that talk more about that in its experience. So absolutely love it. It's worth its flowers. If you're tired of hearing about it, I get it. But the reason why you're hearing about it so much is because it's worth it. It's so worth it. Also, this cover, never get sick of this cover. I never get sick of it. It's gorgeous. Beautiful book. Who did it? Because y'all know I'm going to say it. Alex Murto. Shout out to Alex Murto for doing this cover because it's gorgeous. Another novel that I I can't even remember where I got this recommendation from because I've never seen it anywhere else. Again, I believe it's an indie author. I think that I was looking for novels to possibly read for the trans rights readathon and really wanted something that wasn't trans femme. I think we have a lot of trans femme recommendations, but not enough trans masc recommendations. And this came up, and that was Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. I read this earlier this year in March. I read it in March for Women's History Month. I think at first I was kind of trying to get it like grounded in it. And then I realized that that's the point. You're not supposed to be grounded in this. This is about a shapeshifter named Paul. Their experience as they move through all of these different forms. You start off with them in college and they're more masked, but they talk about how they move throughout, switching between those shapes and shifting between different genders and experiences and expressions through who they're, depending on who they're trying to be with. They even find themselves at a butch lesbian show at one point, and how they change themselves in the moment in order to fit this girl they see across the room, and that conversation. And then it shifts from there into them transitioning into being full femme in order to be with a woman that they fell in love with who identifies as a lesbian, and they met them in their femme form. They prefer them in their femme form, and they're attracted to them in that form. And what that experience is as they're in the Midwest and around a lot of other lesbians, and then transitioning again into another mask form, but something different than where we started in the book, as they're in San Francisco now and living with other queer masks. And what was really great were some of the ruminations that happened with Paul with other people in this book. I think the actual situations that they're in aren't as powerful, but when they're sitting here and they're having these conversations with others is what seems to be the most impactful. Like about how lesbians treat each other, how gay men treat each other. Where does that happen? And this is all happening during the 90s as well. So there was a lot of experiences and conversations in regards to that. In the end, I ended up really, really loving this and feeling like it was super impactful. The part that I loved the most was this conversation that Paul ends up having with another classmate when he's over at their place one day, and talking about music and rock music, and how queer rock music is, and how queer music is, period, and sampling and names within rock music, and why women are already assumed in many ways to be inherently queer from the get. If, a woman stands on stage and their name is Stevie Nicks, no one bats an eye, no one thinks any different to it in regards to like their name being very masculine. But if somebody like Sylvester stands up on stage and is extremely gender bending and very femme but has a masked name, now we have an issue. Now we no longer can do shows. What are those conversations? What's the conversation of sampling and remakes? When we talk about remakes, it was beautiful how they moved through this conversation of music as expression of gender. And it's a monologue that's like a couple of pages long, but it's probably the most, I've thought about it basically every week or so. I'm constantly thinking about this conversation that they had in this book. And while that may not have been the main point of this book, I've never heard that before. And it was spoken so well. The ending of this book really has to do more so, again, with that thing of just being, just wanting to be, not be, and I know I don't want to say like, I don't want to be perceived, but the act of just wanting to be, not being identified, not having an identification, but just wanting to do something because it feels right for who you are in that moment. And that's it. And there's no other expectation for that. And I feel like that's where the ending of this book kind of landed, which I constantly constantly think about it all the time. What this book really meant, and different parts of it pop up to me all the time. So recommend this. I do not know why there's not more people who are reading this book, but it really was great and sexy and weird and lovely and all of those things. Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl. I hope more people are picking this up this year. The last novel on this list is one that we saw tons last year, and I fell in love with it last year. I know that some people hated this book because it is a lot. That's Little Rot by Akwaeke Emezi. Sorry, y'all. I love this book. I know that there's a lot of you out there who hated this book. And then there's those of us who love this book. I think that there's no in between for this because of how aggressive it is. It is full tilt, highest saturation, ultimate contrast type of book ever. And reading it is very fast. They're not preparing you for anything. We are moving through the lives of all of these different people in this underground Nigeria. And it's difficult. These people are experiencing abuse constantly. And there's sex parties, and there's questions of sexuality, and there's murder, and there's abduction, and there's money laundering, and there's pure evil that's happening within this book. And I think some people weren't ready for that and were kind of like, I don't think that I would have liked more backstory, I guess, is what I've heard a lot of. A lot of people are like, it's not saying that these conversations, these things aren't happening, but I received no backstory. It feels like it was just given to me for the shock. And while I feel like personally, I felt like it read like a movie, and maybe that's why I wasn't having an issue with how quickly things were moving and how much of a downturn spiral things were happening in. And I think the other thing is that this does not end on a good note. This does not end on a good note whatsoever. Everybody is basically in a bad situation for the most part. And I think that's another thing that a lot of people are just like, is that it? And it's like, yeah, it is. This was a horrible situation. But I think that also this talks very honestly about the homophobia that's happening in Africa, in Nigeria, in these places. Very no holds bar. And it's talking about it very honestly. And I think that some people just weren't ready for those conversations, especially in a place where, like in America, where while we are currently fighting more than ever for those rights, unfortunately, it's very different. It's a very different flavor than how all the characters in here are underground still to express those rights, to express those things. Who they're also like constantly fighting for their lives and trying to survive in here as well. It was gritty. It was hard. Trigger warnings out the wazoo. And I think that was another issue too, is that this didn't have trigger warnings. I'm pretty positive. And I'll be upfront about it. They should have put trigger warnings in here. I will say that. I think that this has to do with pedophilia. This has to do with abduction. This has to do with, rape. This has to do with murder. This has to do with a lot of horrible, horrible things. And I think if you're not prepared to experience those things or talk about those things, this isn't going to be for you. And I think those trigger warnings would be important. I think that's another reason why this has not received enough praise, because audiences weren't prepared for what this conversation was going to be, especially when this author has come out with books like Bitter and Pet, which are technically YA novels. I think this is also why they put out this novel, so that they could get out of the YA genre. So that's my 2 cents. But I really loved it. I think if you're the right audience and you're ready for a conversation like this, just like what I had mentioned with Womb City, I think it's important that you're the audience for this, and you'll get a lot out of it. That is my list of my very brief list in the grand scheme of my entire bookshelf, but my brief list of a few queer, weird lit and authors to read this month. I think, there's one on there, Monstrilio, that is definitely, you're gonna see around a lot this month, but I feel like that conversation that I was bringing up, I just don't see enough of it. And I wish that we were seeing more of that, because I feel like that's why I love that book. But as for the rest of them, I love them. I wish that more people would probably read them. I may just be late on some of them. I know that like some of those books came out maybe a couple of years ago, and some people are just not into reading back catalogs. But I hope that you enjoyed today's book recommendations video. Please subscribe down below if you're interested in any more book recommendations. There will be plenty coming this month. I've caught a kind of, I've kind of gotten into the groove of doing these book recommendation videos and putting them out on time, and I'm really excited. I feel really good making videos right now. So I can't wait to share some of those other videos that I talked about in the beginning with y'all. I have a lot of book recommendations and a lot of different things that I've not seen a lot of, or maybe not even heard like some of the discussions of, and I'm really happy to be sharing them with y'all. So thank you for watching today's video. I will see y'all in the next one. Bye.